So here is the project which was created. And I did open it in Visual Studio Code, which is a free IDE which I can strongly recommend for Angular or for web development in general. You find versions for every operating system and you can install it and you should see something like this. Now I tweaked some settings there. For example, I installed a special theme here. I installed the Darkula theme, and you can install extensions by going to the extensions area here under view extensions. And there, for example, if you search for Darkula, you can find that theme I installed, which of course is totally optional. I also installed the Material icon theme to have nicer file icons, which is also optional. And this is also optional, but my recommendation, I also installed the Angular Essentials extension pack by John Papa, which installs a couple of extensions that make your life as an Angular developer much easier in Visual Studio Code. So I do recommend this Angular Essentials extension. After installing all of those and activating them and reloading, you should have a project that looks something like this. Now I did add a .prettier.rc file to configure Prettier, which is the file formatter I'm using, and I set it to use single quotes here, basically just how it should auto-format my code. Auto-formatting is something you can do with a keyboard shortcut here. If you search for format document, this shortcut will auto-format your code with a tool of your choice, in my case Prettier, which is part of that Angular Essentials package, and this will make your code easier to read, fix simple errors, and simply give you a better time as a developer. This is the starting project therefore, and this is a typical Angular project as it's generated by the CLI. I haven't changed anything in there. Now, of course, you know this project, right? We worked in a project like this throughout the entire course. We get the source folder with the app folder, and in there we can add our Angular components and services and directives and everything and write our Angular app. Now, we'll not focus on creating an app in this module. Instead, we'll focus on the project and what you can do with the app, where the CLI can help you, how you can deploy this, and so on. So therefore, now that we have this basic setup and we understand what we do have here, we also see we have tons of configuration files here. So why don't we take a closer look at those to fully understand what the CLI gave us there? So it's configuration file time. We do have a bunch of files and let's go through them to understand what we got here. Now, please note, over time, some files and the content of some files can change, but the general idea, of course, is the same. Now let's start with the editor config. This is a file which in the end is picked up by some editors, by some IDEs, like Visual Studio Code, and it basically tells the editor how to, for example, do indentation in this project so that it can override your user default settings or the IDE default settings and make sure that the code in this project actually is the same for all users across the entire world, no matter which editor they use. So this is simply a code style thing. This of course does not affect the way Angular works or how you write Angular code. It really just influences how the code looks like and is formatted. Prettier.rc, by the way, is kind of related to this, but is not part of a default Angular project, at least not at the point of time I'm recording this. This is a file I added here to tell this auto formatting tool, Prettier, which I'm using behind the scenes, to basically use single instead of double quotes. So in the end, this should work together with editor config. Now I skipped gitignore. Gitignore, of course, matters if you're working with Git. Git is a source control tool. It helps you create code snapshots and go back to older code snapshots if you mess something up and so on. And you can learn more about Git with the attached Git starting resources. And gitignore is a file which basically tells Git which files it can ignore, which files you don't want to manage with Git because they will be regenerated frequently, like node modules, which you generate by running npm install, and so on. Now, the Angular JSON file is a bit of a more complex file. This manages your entire project configuration, and I will come back to that in a second. Let's skip it for now, and let's move on to the browsers list instead. The browsers list file is an amazing file. This configuration file is picked up by the Angular CLI when you build your project for production. And it basically tells the Angular CLI which browsers you want to support with your project. Now, the Angular CLI takes this information about which browsers you want to support. In my case here, for example, that I don't want to support Internet Explorer 9 to 11, which you would have to change here. Remove not, as you see, if you do want to support it. And the CLI will then use this information, for example, to adjust your CSS styles and prefix them to support all these browsers, and also to load the right polyfills and create the right code bundles that include those polyfills. And more on polyfills and what the CLI does with them later. But this really allows you to control which browsers your application supports. And of course, you want to be as restrictive as possible here and not as open as possible, because that will ultimately lead to less code which your users have to download. So if you know you don't have to support Internet Explorer 9 to 11, well, you should not support it. The Angular framework, by the way, does support those browsers, but still, excluding them can make sense to ship less code. The Karma config file here, that's a file which is used for testing in the end, for unit tests, where Angular, the Angular CLI, uses Karma behind the scenes. And unless you really know what you're doing, you should leave it the way it is. It allows you to fine-tune how your tests are executed and so on. Package log.json is a file which is generated based on your package.json file, which in turn is a file that manages the packages your project uses and the versions of those packages. Now, with my current theme, I see that's a bit hard to read, so let me quickly switch this to the default Dark Plus theme, where this is a bit easier to read. Now, what do we have here? Now, this package.json file has a couple of scripts we can execute. We can also use just the ng command, though, so we can ignore this. Behind the scenes, this uses the ng command. More interesting are the dependencies and def dependencies. I did talk about them earlier in the course already. In the end, these are the third-party packages our project uses to build our application and to run successfully. That includes all the different parts of the Angular framework, RxJS for observables, and then some dependencies of the Angular framework. But we also got some development dependencies, which are tools we only need to build our project. So this is not code which will be part of our running application. These will be tools that help us build the application efficiently. That's the Angular CLI, and then a couple of tools used by the CLI for compiling and optimizing the code. We got Karma for testing, we got TypeScript for compiling TypeScript to JavaScript, and so on. Now, you use this file by running npm install in the terminal or command prompt, navigate it into your project folder, and here I'm just using the built-in one, which you get with terminal, new terminal. And this will basically create that node modules folder based on the dependencies mentioned here. It will also generate a package.log.json file, which stores the exact versions of your third-party dependencies. Because here in package.json, you specify some minimum requirements and some flexibility. And then once you do run npm install, you log in certain exact versions, which are saved in here. And last but not least, we got the tsconfig files down there. Now we see three tsconfig.json files. This configures the TypeScript compiler. And if you took my Understanding TypeScript course here on Udemy, which of course is not a hard requirement, you know what you can set there. The official TypeScript documentation, of course, is another great place. Now, unless you know what you're doing, you can leave the defaults here. But there you can set certain interesting things. For example, you can add strict mode by setting this to true, and now TypeScript will be way more restrictive regarding what you're allowed to do in your code. This can be a pro and can be a con, depending on which kind of code you're writing, how many third-party packages you're using, and so on. It can force you to write cleaner code, but it also sometimes means that you have to find workarounds to get something to work in TypeScript, which you know will work, but where TypeScript doesn't fully understand your code. So here you can configure TypeScript, and you have this base configuration file here, and then two specific configuration files which extend this base configuration file for testing, for the testing environment, and for the real app compilation. And there some detailed settings can be set for the concrete compilation of the app. Now, what you'll also see, by the way, is one extra flag which is not default TypeScript, and that's the Angular compiler options. This is picked up by the Angular compiler, which is not the TypeScript compiler, which is the compiler that kicks in after TypeScript compiled your TypeScript code to JavaScript. The Angular compiler will then compile your Angular application, so your compiled JavaScript code and your HTML templates and so on, into instructions that can be executed at runtime. So instructions to insert buttons in the DOM, to add event listeners, and so on. So the real DOM instructions that the browser understands. That's what the Angular compiler will do, and you can configure that compiler as well. And unsurprisingly, again, the official docs are a great resource here. Under Dev Workflow, AOT Compiler, Angular Compiler Options, you find detailed information about the Angular compiler and which options you can set there. Now, as always, mostly the defaults will work for you, but you can check out this detailed documentation here to see whether you need to set some other setting there to build your Angular application the way you want. And last but not least, we have the TS-lint JSON file here. This simply is used for linting, which checks your code quality and basically tells you whether you're following best practices and you wrote your code in a good way. If you get errors here, these are not real errors. These are just improvement recommendations on how you could improve your code. Though, of course, sometimes there all just is a recommendation which you don't have to follow, because not all these recommendations are best practices. Some simply are opinions which you don't have to share. So this is what we have here in terms of configuration files. Now let's again think about some Angular CLI commands before we dive into that missing configuration file, the Angular JSON file.